evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you here, and very joyous of you to spend your Valentine's evening with us, or at least start your evening with us tonight. So if you don't know me, my name is Jo Applin. I'm a professor in the history of art here at the Courtauld, where I'm also director of the Centre for American Art. And it really is my immense pleasure to introduce Professor Julia Bryan-Wilson this evening to celebrate her most recent book, Louise Nevelson's sculpture, Drag, Colour, Joy, Face, which was published by Yale University Press in 2023 with fully correct punctuation in the title. I should add as well that Julia is a long-standing friend, not only of me personally, but also of the Courtauld. In 2014, she was the Terra visiting professor here. And we also had the pleasure of hosting a launch for Julia's previous book at the Courtauld, Fray, which was every bit as busy as tonight's event. And it just shows how important her work is to so many of us. Such is her importance and the phenomenal impact of Julia's writing on the field of modern and contemporary art. I just want to spend a bit of time here outlining some of her many achievements. Simply saying she needs no introduction doesn't quite cut it. I want to draw out what it is that makes her work so important, what threads and ties run through her practice as a teacher, writer and curator, as they will no doubt return in our conversation this evening. Julia is Professor of LGBTQ+ art history at Columbia University in New York, where she also sits on the core faculty of the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender. In addition, she is an accomplished curator, and she currently holds the title of Curator at Large at the Museo d'Arte de Sao Paulo. Julia is renowned not only for being the most prominent and respected scholar working right now in contemporary art history, but also for how she goes about doing that work. She is unfailingly generous, politically engaged, and fiercely collaborative in all of her endeavours. It's this that makes her, in addition, such an in-demand curator, and we are lucky that Julia's being with us this week as our as a professor with us at the Courtauld has coincided with the opening of the Barbican's brilliant show Unravel, the Power and Politics of Textiles in Art, and I was talking earlier, and she served as the advisor to that exhibition. Other recent curatorial work includes her exhibition Louise Nevelson Persistence, which was an official collateral event at the Venice Biennale in 2022, and her co-curated show Cecilia Vicuña, About to Happen, which opened at the Contemporary Art Centre New Orleans in 2017 and travelled to Berkeley Art Museum, the Henry Art Gallery, the ICA Philadelphia, and MoCA North Miami. Julia is the author of 4 books, as well as numerous articles, some prize-winning, and essays in books and exhibition catalogues. Look them up if you don't know them. Her first book, Artwork as Radical Practice in the Vietnam War Era, was an instant classic. It was named Best Book of the Year by the New York Times and Art Forum, and it continues to be translated in new editions, its most recent iteration in its forthcoming in Japanese. That book laid the groundwork for so much of what was to come in her career, a continued insistence on the politics of making and the social and economic realities of what it means not only to labour as an artist, but to take on the mantle of the labouring worker, and all of those classed, raced and gendered assumptions that accompany such a position. Julia's second book, Art in the Making, was published by Thames and Hudson in 2016, and it signalled her expansion of her work on the politics of art making as labour to focus on the politics of making writ large on a global scale across 9 chapters, each devoted to a particular idiom, from painting, woodworking and building to performing, fabricating, digitising and crowdsourcing. And I list them here to give a sense of Julia's extraordinary range and commitments. She's a materialist in every sense of the word, every good sense of that word. More recently, her groundbreaking book, Fray, Art and Textile Politics, was published by the University of Chicago in 2017. It was a New York Times Best Art Book of the Year and winner of the Frank Jewett Mather Award, the Robert Motherwell Book Award, and the Association for the Study of the Arts of the Present Book Prize, and deservedly so. Frey insists on the importance of thinking with and through textiles and fabric. It explores work by American and Chilean artists through a series of startling pairings and juxtapositions. It places textiles at the forefront of debates about process, materiality, gender, and race. Frey contains all of the hallmarks we've come to expect from Julia's work: limpid, eloquent prose, careful attention to the process and practice of making, always with a sharp, critical eye on the histories and contexts typically used to frame those practices, which she pulls apart and rebuilds, producing a powerful political challenge to the discipline from the inside out. All of this and more is in evidence too in her latest extraordinary book, which we're here to discuss this evening. I can't do justice to the range and scope of Julia's work here, certainly not without eating even more into the time we've set aside to hear from Julia herself. So I'm just going to stop now and hand over to Julia, who's going to talk for about 20 minutes to introduce the book to you, after which she'll join me for a conversation, and you as well. You'll be welcome to join in with comments, questions and remarks. And there'll be drinks afterwards in the research forum just down the corridor, to which you're all warmly welcome. So for now, please join me in welcoming Julia. Oh, Julia.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you to the Courtauld. Thank you all for being here. I am well aware that it's, for some, a special night. For others, perhaps you're here out of spite. And in which case, for either of you, for both of you, welcome. As Jo mentioned, I'm going to give a very casual overview of some of the themes and especially talk about the structure of this book. And I'm really happy to answer questions and hear comments from you in this more formal setting, but also with a celebratory drink in hand after. So just to set the stage a little and ground us in time and space, Louise Nevelson was born in a small village outside of Kiev in what was then Tsarist Russia and is now known as Ukraine. It's called Pereyaslav. It's about 60 miles outside of Kiev in 1899, and she died in 1988. Lived a long, full life. From a very young age, she identified as an artist, and especially as a sculptor. But she only found fame when she was in her 50s, though she had been working steadily and to kind of mixed success for some decades. I decided, so I'm just showing you a clipping from her archives where I spent many, many months delving into all of her papers, and a kind of maybe classic example that you might be familiar with because it's here at Tate Modern, called Black Wall from 1959, which is kind of right as she is finding her mature idiom and the kind of the style that she would basically pursue for the rest of her life. And that's black assemblages made out of wood. So why Louise Nevelson? It's a question I asked myself many times because I pursued this research and writing for about 10 years. That's about how long books take, I guess. And I think one thing that drove me was to really focus on the work. She was really an extraordinary person, and she's had several very well-researched biographies of her life, but I wanted to spend my attention, the bulk of my attention, looking at the process of making and her materials and the kind of what she did with these found scraps of wood. And of course, the life is still important because it structures the kind of conditions of possibility of making, but I very much was writing against the grain of the accounts that so constantly tethered her art to her body. So one of the challenges I faced when thinking about this oeuvre was the fact that, she did kind of fall into, or embrace, I should say, a certain set of kind of protocols of making around scavenging and assembling and the grid-based relief, monochromatic, that she stuck to with a kind of astonishing fealty for some decades. But I think part of the challenge of her work is understanding that for her, these kind of bits of matter spoke a certain, kind of speak a certain language, and that though I had been told as a student many times, oh, Louise Nevelson, she's not kind of properly in the canon, or she's sort of outside a canon. We don't quite know where to put her. Was she a kind of belated abstract expressionist? Is she a belated cubist? Is she a a minimalist avant la lettre? Like, where does she fit? And not so she kind of doesn't. She doesn't have a very secure place, though she is ubiquitous. That was one of the kind of paradoxes, like someone who's kind of everywhere and yet also sort of nowhere. Also the idea that, like I said, was sort of received wisdom when I was a graduate student, which was that the work all looks the same. Something I heard many times. Oh, you just see one, you've seen them all. All the work looks the same. And I put here in front of you two works that are separated by some decades, that are even titled the same, Sky Cathedral 1, Sky Cathedral 2, and while I acknowledge the consistency of her style, I mean, these patently do not look the same. There's all kinds of differences in the works that she generated, but I wanted to, I also felt like that's not a criticism that often comes up around someone like Mark Rothko. Well, all the work looks the same. I felt like the sexist criticism of this work was so intense to me. So part of the reason I called my Venice show Persistence was because I really wanted to push back against this idea that, oh, she only just made one piece again and again. It's like, no, she found her idiom, and she had incredible stuff, that sustained her. Like, she was persistent. She had fealty to this style. Something about this spoke to her, something about scavenged wood, assembled in a grid-like relief, painted one color, like she had stories to tell that unfold with that style, and I, rather than dismiss them as all looking the same, one has to acknowledge, yeah, we get that we understand her style, it's graspable, she has a strong aesthetic, but that's not a negative. To me, that's not something that detracts my interest. It in fact makes me want to lean in to, well, what are the differences, or what are the similarities? In fact, what are the continuities? Why would she return again and again over decades to something that, to this very same kind of set of techniques? So part of the challenge for me in writing this book was that I wanted it to be a critical monograph of the work, not a biography of the life. There actually has never been such a volume until mine. There has never been a critical monograph focused on Louise Nevelson. And because I wanted to honor those consistencies, it didn't make sense to me to write a chronological account which I could have, because, she did live a life in time. Her life unfolded year after year. I could have started with kind of the student work, and then this, and then, and gone through in chronological phases, and that something would have been illuminated in that, I'm sure. But because I wanted to honor the consistencies and the way that she kind of obsessively returned to the same materials and process, I decided I needed a kind of radical new format. And so I managed to convince my editor, we can maybe talk about that in the Q&A, because that's a whole other novel to unspool, but I managed to convince my editor that the book would be best served as a modular monograph, which is a term I invented for the occasion, which is that it's published in 4 independent volumes in a black slipcase that can be read in any order. And in fact, this is an echo of some of Nevelson's own work, her early work from the 50s, where if you were a collector or if you purchased one of these pieces, these wall reliefs, you in fact could move the gridded segments around as you pleased. So they had this unfixed kind of iterative quality. That came to an end when she started being represented, when she started having gallery representation in 1962, and the dealer was like, no more of that. These need to be kind of fixed, no more of this kind of playing in space. But in order to echo that modularity, that kind of feeling that like the order was, I wouldn't say random, it's not at all random, but that the viewer has some agency in how they come to these segments first, I wanted to pay homage to that in the format. And I will say, again, something to talk about in the Q&A is I think this was always my dream and my passion to have it be represented like this. In part, it isn't a relinquishing of my own authority because it doesn't, there's not the here's my introduction. Now my argument unfolds, page after page, and then there's the conclusion. And often multi-volume sets are these kind of like very heavy tomes, like Jasper Johns, Catalog Raisonné. It's like occupies this much space and it costs like $700. And these are very thin and light, and I really thought of them as these kind of, something that you could put in your purse and read on the tube. I wanted them to be kind of accessible, but in a way, I think it has, when I actually got it when I was sent the first when I got it in the mail, and this volume slid out of the case, and I realized like, oh, people are really gonna read these in every order, The second they're out of the box, like that, I really have given over a lot of, just the sequence that, this kind of an idea that there is a sequence, and there really isn't. I mean, the sequence of the title kind of is meant to refer to her own process, which I'll talk about, but I did write those so that they could somewhat function independently. And it's really scary, I'll just be honest. It's scary, it's risky. I know someone wanted to review the book and then ended up not reviewing it because she lost one of the volumes. This is the kind of thing that has happened since I published it, which is feeling a little bit like it's so weird, it so kind of doesn't conform to what we think of as like the definitive account, that it's, I've had some people be a little confused by it. What can I say? People have been confused. But I'm still happy that I took the risk because it seems, like we need to keep pushing these forms forward, and especially around this vaunted thing, called the monograph, which is supposed to be, has all this weight and authority within the discipline of art history. So the 4 volumes are each organized around a keyword, and they're keywords that are both verbs and also nouns that are significant for me in terms of her own procedures. So the title, drag, there's many different resonances. They kind of, I speak about a lot of different meanings of that word, but first and foremost, when you drag something, when you like drag a river, you're trawling, right? You're like scraping the bottom to like get objects or try to find something. And Nevelson, above all, was a scavenger. She dragged the streets of New York. She dragged construction sites to find her basic materials. So I'm just showing you a few of the many, many photographs of her living space and environment where she was just absolutely in the thrall of reused wood and broken apart furniture, chair legs, spindles, wood paintbrush handles, wooden toilet seats, doorknobs, wooden cornices, you name it, architecture, furniture, construction materials. She loved used wood, and she felt that it told stories and it held some history. I will say it's very interesting, just as I cast my eye over her entire oeuvre, she was not that interested in trees. She wasn't interested in driftwood. She didn't have the feeling of the branch or an understanding of the twig. She wanted wood that had been processed or manufactured by human hands. And a lot of the work's kind of formal tension is between the sort of rectilinear grid, often liquor crates, orange crates, and turned decorative elements. So the idea of kind of volume versus plane is something that, to me, that tension is kind of throughout a lot of the works. So this is her bathroom, filled with all of the wood, a corner filled with wood. So these are the dragged elements, scavenged elements. And I talk not only about scavenging as a kind of resource for women and also for kind of minoritized subjects, but also I turn to Agnes Varda and the idea of the gleaner and the sense that Nevelson, she's like a dragger, a scraper, a scavenger, but also she's a gleaner, and I put her in conversation with other female gleaners. This is one of Nevelson's collages. She made thousands of collages, small scale, in her lifetime, kind of after she was done in the studio with the larger scale sculptures. She made collages out of just anything she had lying around. This is a piece of a quilt, which I've put next to the Black American quilter Rosie Lee Tompkins, who was born Effie Mae Howard. And thinking about, how quilt making, piecework, scrap together objects is all a kind of method of dragging. And I talk more about the collages, which are these kind of laboratories for formalism. And they're really extraordinary. I don't, if you happen to see the show in Venice, it was sort of organized around how the formal innovations of the collages that haven't really been that much discussed, or not until very recently. So I'm just kind of plowing through all this. Of course, there were many other resonances of drag, but maybe we can get into all that in the Q&A. The next, so she would bring in objects up the street. Then in a kind of unusual jumping around in the normal process, she then would dip things into, she would then paint things. So she often would bring in, let's say like, oh, a broken apart chair. She would then dip it into these buckets of black paint. She didn't want to have like wood with its found color lying around. So things would then be colored. So drag first, color next. So in color, I confront not only questions of pigment, and especially her fealty to blackness, about which she was quite a theorist. She had a lot to say about why black over her lifetime. And I also talk about color as in racialization and her complicated, I would say, relationship to blackness as a racial category in the civil rights era in the US as a Jewish woman. And she and her family left Pereyaslav when she was around 6 because of anti-Jewish violence in Tsarist Russia, and she experienced a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment in Rockland, Maine, which is where she and her family ended up. So, and she spoke Yiddish at home. She was really othered in her own, in her lifetime. So this is, and color, of course, that's a really big word. So I'm not only talking about paint, I'm not only talking about race, but I'm also interestingly talking about the kind of problem of reproduction, which of course accompanies all artworks, especially sculptures, I would argue, but kind of has really vexed Nevelson's work when it's reproduced on the page. So this is a good comparison where two works, similar works, because of either overexposure or underexposure, look really radically different. And Sky Cathedral on the left, I mean, we have trained ourselves because of conventions of photography. I think we kind of grasp that that's all black, but when you really look at it, like, it's almost white. You know, it has become so, like, the kind of relative matte of the paint, it's shining so much in the flash that there's parts of it that are so light gray as to be almost white, versus the one that's on the right, which, you know, kind of is so inked out that you can really not hardly even see necessarily its components. So part of the kind of ethics of putting this book together involved me standing in front of as many Nevelsons as I could in person and taking the pictures myself. Partially because this was such a problem. You know, so many of the images that are out there are so deceptive, or just don't give enough information, or literally it's an all black work, but it looks white on the page, and I really wanted to try to do justice. But I also was thinking through the kind of problem or the inherent bias, the inherent racism of the photographic medium, and how it was, you know, since the time of its invention, calibrated to register light skin as opposed to darker hues. And so for me to stand in front of it myself and take these pictures and see how my camera was reacting was just part of me grappling with it from my own embodied perspective. And the entire book is really, in part, a kind of way to chronicle the work of what it is to be an art historian, you know, so those things don't fade into the background. And I mean, this is not a book about me by any means. This is a book about Louise Nevelson, but it's a book about my encounters with Louise Nevelson from a very specific perspective, which is mine as a queer feminist, like white woman, I would say. And so there are moments, hopefully it's a light touch, where I narrate my own, you know, troubles with calibrating my camera, or I narrate my own surprises, or I narrate, you know, the smell of the dust, for example. So she did not only make all black works, that was the kind of predominant color that she went to, but she did have some forays into both all white and also into all gold, and you're so very lucky because you have one of the major all gold pieces here in London at Tate Modern. It was restored because the paint that she used, which was really cheap hardware spray paint, you know, from the hardware store, it flakes really easily, it cracks, and because wood is really porous. It's all constantly expanding and contracting within the environment. So her works are actually very unstable and kind of constantly need to be restored or repainted, etc. So they just did an amazing renovation or restoration of an American tribute to the British people. It's wonderfully kitschy and gaudy. That's how it was received in its own time. The black works have a kind of somberness, or you can kind of project somberness onto them, even though the things she said about her black works was that it was about greatness and plenitude and infinity and aristocracy. And the gold works, I think, are just come off as sort of like, gaudy and excessive. She was, this is kind of a turning point, the Dawn's Wedding piece on the left, which is, like I said, she had been working as an artist for decades, having small shows, etc. She did not sell a single work until 1959, when she was herself 59. And she was included in this show, 16 Americans, that's an installation shot, curated by Dorothy Miller, that included a 23-year-old Frank Stella. And it was meant to be a show of emerging American artists. So here she was, a 60-year-old emerging artist. And, as compared to Frank Stella, who immediately, sold all of his works at the fresh age of 23. And this just goes back to the persistent gendering and sexism that she faced throughout her career. Another one of the projects of the book, I guess, is to not only put Nevelson in a bigger conversation within the history of 20th century American art, but also to think about all the genealogies of making that she might have been in conversation with. So as we know, those of us who publish books and those of you who will publish books, you have like a set number of images. A book is not a lecture. You can't just put in every single thing you're thinking of, too bad, alas. You have, let's say the exact number for this book was 100. You have 100 illustrations. So every single image in there really better be doing some work. You cannot afford an extraneous thing or a duplicate thing. And so this is always, it's agonizing. It's always a very agonizing thing is to put together the image program. And I made a decision kind of early on that the images that I was going to prioritize as her comparators were not going to be the kind of usual suspects. So this is a moment in the color volume where I'm talking about what I call the material monochrome. So yes, her work is in conversation with histories of avant-garde modernist monochromes. Kazimir Malevich springs to mind, but I do not illustrate. I mentioned Kazimir Malevich, he's important. I do not illustrate Kazimir Malevich, and instead I illustrate Ukrainian white work. She would have been familiar. Ukraine has a really extraordinary history with whitework embroidery. It's a really massive literature, in fact, so I kind of go to the library like, I'm just going to pick up a book or two about Ukrainian whitework, and then there's a whole an unbelievable amount. It's an extremely rich tradition. And she collected embroideries and needlework. And then, so on the left, there's whitework, because of course, Malevich did not invent the monochrome. People have been, women especially, have been thinking about white on white for centuries before Malevich ever put that title together. And then on the right, black on black is also not simply the purview, of avant-garde artists. This is a beautiful ceramic by the indigenous couple, Maria and Julian Martinez, who are based in Santa Fe, and Louise Nevelson also collected native ceramics of the Southwest. So I speculate, I don't know for a fact, a lot of this is about kind of theoretical speculation, that she would have exactly known this kind of blackware, but I bet that she did, because this blackware would have been already highly prized and in circulation. And it is absolutely gorgeous work that is about textural contrast versus shine versus matte, making pattern designs. So instead of a Malevich, or Rauschenberg, I go to indigenous pottery and women's embroidery from Ukraine. Just to finish up the color volume, I mentioned how this is also a volume in which I'm thinking about kind of Nevelson's own relationship to not being considered white as a Jewish immigrant and refugee. She made works that specifically dealt with that identity, including there's two sculptures, monumental sculptures, that make explicit reference to the Holocaust. This one is called Homage to 6,000,001. The other one is called Homage to 6,000,002. And I put that in conversation with another piece that's another homage to Martin Luther King Jr., which she made for over a span of some years. And interestingly, the piece on the right was the first work by someone who does not identify as Black to enter the collection of the Studio Museum in Harlem. And she wanted to give it to them. And of course, an artist can't just give things to museums. They have to officially acquire it and accept the gift, because it's a lot of stewardship and caretaking, and they have to agree to conserve it forever. And they actually rewrote their mission, the Studio Museum. They rewrote their mission statement so that it wasn't just we collect works by Black artists or African descendant artists, but also works by others that are in conversation with themes of the African diaspora. So this is an amazing moment that her gift would actually catalyze an institutional shift in the Studio Museum. So after Nevelson has dragged things in, she's dunked them in black or white or gold, then she hammers them together. So this volume join is about the kind of political question of assemblage. It's also, I dive into kind of histories of women and carpentry. Of course, women have often been excluded from practices of woodworking. This is, you can see, and I also talk about the kind of often unfinished quality of her works. And I think the reproductions are deceptive not only at the level of hue, because we so often see them, they're registering as gray instead of all black, for example, but they're very deceptive because I think in pictures they can look kind of sleek and really finished or mechanical, or there's something kind of computational about how they look, and in person they are quite shambolic, they are splintered, they are scuffed, there's raw pieces of, the paint, as even ones that have been kind of freshly restored, there's nails sticking out, There is a sense of a kind of jangly transparency that she's really not interested in kind of veiling or mystifying the fact that these are hammered together, with these very utilitarian means. And this is a picture of her wielding the hammer and nail. Joining is also, a word from carpentry, and so I do talk a little bit about how she actually put things together. I also talk about the idea of her household conjoinings, or her kind of kinships. And one thing that was important to me was to name her assistants and kind of give them their due. I think we all too often, in the annals of art history, we don't pay enough attention to really the people doing the work, of actually, wielding the machine or digging the ore, etc. So this was a really important assistant and also companion, Diana McCown, who lived with Nevelson for 26 years and traveled with her everywhere. They co-owned pets. In Nevelson's lifetime, they were rumored to be lovers, and I pay attention to those rumors. It's not my job. I don't understand my job to be about authenticating gossip or disproving it. I just let the rumors circulate in the text as what it is, which is suggestion and innuendo. That's a lot of how lesbian lives have been understood in the past. And I make claims about Nevelson as a queer figure because she did definitely inhabit a sort of non-normative lifestyle. She did get married when she was 19 to a rich man, Charles Nevelson. She moved to New York to be with him. She had a child. She very quickly realized that life was not for her. It was very confining. She abandoned her son. She got divorced. She refused alimony. And she always said that her biggest mistake in life was getting married. She really rejected heterosexuality. And she lived with this woman for 26 years. The nature of their partnership remains, but fully, in terms of intimacy or eroticism, remains unknown to me, and it was just really not my question to pursue the kind of facts of the matter of, she definitely, as you can see here, this is a really, to me, telling picture of their dynamic, which is Nevelson is got one finger, steadying a piece of wood, and it's Diana McCown whose hand is bordered with motion, because she's the one actually wielding the hammer, and she has nails in between her teeth. So join also thinks about conjoinings, including kind of these household conjoinings. So the fourth volume is called Face. So after dragging, coloring, joining, then the works go back out into the world, right? They face the world. So Face is about that moment of return, or moment of facing, and it's also about her public commissions that she started taking in 1969. It was her first. It was called Atmospheres and Environments on the campus of Princeton. She started making large-scale outdoor sculpture. This is one example. She never quite got, or she never at all, I would say, got away from the sense of what I call faciality or frontality. Like, her work is really sided, S-I-D-E-D. Like, even though it's untethered from the wall, like the work is no longer a relief that has to use the wall as a support when it's outside, they definitely have like a face or a front. And they're interesting from all perspectives, but she really worked on that. She really had, sidedness was really part of her kind of artistic idiom. I'm showing you also, just so you can see how sometimes the reliefs are quite shallow. So this is a piece called Total Totality. That's at the Fog at Harvard, and you can see this is a picture I took from the side, how very narrow it really is, and how the sense of the facade, right? It's almost a kind of, feeling. So I was playing a lot with face, faciality, facade, how we face something. I think I put this one in the slideshow, Total Totality, not only to show you another example, but also because its title, with this use of the word total or totality, brings me to Levinas. And Levinas was a very big touchstone for me in this volume because I was thinking about the ethics of what it means to face a Nevelson work. Levinas was a near contemporary, close contemporary to Nevelson's. He was born also in the early 20th century, also in Tsarist Russia, Jewish, in what was now present-day Lithuania, and he too had to leave because of anti-Semitism. So Levinas, of course, had a theory about faciality and ethics as rooted in an encounter with another that is mediated, importantly mediated and rooted in the face. So I turned to Levinas to think about the ethics of this encounter. I also am really interested in not only the circulation of Nevelson in the kind of fine art institutional world, like museums, galleries, her appearance in 1962 at the Venice Biennial, the moment that she finally, sells a piece to the Brooklyn Museum. Of course, these are major and important, should not be neglected. She also is having a simultaneous life in all of these other registers that are usually not really that much talked about or granted attention in, which are like has been a major inspiration for children's arts and crafts projects. And like to this day, there's whole websites and workbooks that you can go to, like, oh, have your kid make a Nevelson, meaning like they can get a shoebox, find wooden things, spray paint in one color, boom, they made, that age. So she so owns that kind of work. I think it's amazing. I think this idea of her influence in this realm is so astonishing. And there's letters in her archive where she's excited to have her work serve as a kind of model for children's learning. So I found all these different examples of children, Sydney students become artists because they've made a Nevelson, and to this day, a lot of my friends who are not in the academy will tell me like, oh my God, my child just like at daycare today, they were like, let's learn about Louise Nevelson and then make a Nevelson. So it's in a way how she has stayed alive to current audiences is through these children's arts and crafts projects. So I spend some attention on that. I take it seriously, and again, part of my kind of political program, I guess, is to think about these more low spaces as just as important as like a critic from the New York Times. So kind of another facet, I should say, of the volume Face is that I also contend with her face, her very legendary face, which really overshadowed the work in her own lifetime. And I grappled with the figure of her as an, very stylish, old, eccentric, diva, grande dame. I gave many talks when I was preparing to write this book, or in the process of it, where I kind of had this polemic that mine was going to be, I'm writing the first critical monograph of Louise Nevelson, and it's not going to have a single photograph of the artist. And I thought that was like a great idea. like an obviously great idea that was going to be all about, there's way too much about her mascara, like literally in her obituaries, people are talking about her mascara and not her art. It was such a focal point in her own life, was like how she looked and her outfits and her hat, scarves and the turbans and the etc. So I was really so strident about that. But almost every time I gave a talk, someone in the audience, invariably an older woman, would say like, you have to show the pictures, like, because we do not see old women in public. Like this very painful erasure, that is enacted everywhere all the time, where old women are just completely gone from public space, and that she so fiercely owned that, So I fully came around and realized that is exactly right. And also her face was part of the reception, her face was part of the reception. It would have been a partial look if I had not somehow grappled with the fact that, her persona was part of how the legend grew. So I chose the pictures very carefully. Like I said, this image program, really keeps us, like, it's tormenting. And so this is the portrait that I landed on by Robert Mapplethorpe. It was actually the last official portrait he ever took, and before he died of AIDS. And it's such a brilliant, she's like, staring out at the viewer as if like to hex us all, like down her nose, wearing this incredible all black brocade and this famous Halston sable hat. And of course, Mapplethorpe's famous for wrenching grays out of black. Like he's such a master of the gelatin silver print in terms of modulation of blackness. So I just love, it just makes me really happy that this image is in the book and that I get to talk about, their kind of shared affinity for blackness. I also included a number of images of fan art, which I found in the archive, and also to me is not just like, oh, what a strange, odd thing that people are making collages out of Nevelson and sending them to her, writing poems and making music, but actually this is this is a history of reception, that I don't know who made this and I don't know when, but it tells a story that I think is really interesting about Nevelson's, kind of volcanic creativity. And this image was actually the picture of her with her glasses and fur coat is from a cover of Architectural Digest. But then I don't know what volcano this is that's exploding, but this idea that she's kind of she is in command of this cauldron, of kind of like ideas, and it's just rushing out of her. She's like adjacent to it. So I just love this image. And I guess that's the end of the thing. I guess I'll just say one very final thing that the volcano with its flames reminds me of is that I did ask myself, as I said many times throughout this decade of research, like, what is it about Nevelson? Like, I had my feminist idea, which is like, well, she's been neglected. That now is the time. I want to do her justice. And that's a good reason. It's a great reason for anybody to do anything. But I just kept, something about it was still a little irrational, as all good research projects are. Like, what was it? Like, did I identify with her as like a fierce older woman? It wasn't quite that. Like, that didn't quite ring true to me. And I kind of realized when I had a deadline to finish the book, and the forest fires in my town of California were just raging around me. It was very difficult and actually very traumatic. That actually, what compelled me about her work was what compelled her about her own work, which was this aliveness of wood. And that wood, to me, my kind of fear of forest fires and the loss of wood, was the thing that kind of kept me connected to the sculptures, that they kind of there was something kind of unspeakable about her use of wood that I wanted to, and it helped me kind of order and structure my own feelings about kind of massive climate loss around trees. So that's kind of, I don't know, that's where maybe we'll end there, because that is kind of the end, that's where I have nothing more to say as far as overview goes, but now we can maybe have a conversation.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I know the book well. I've had the privilege of first hearing you talk about it as a series of propositions and questions when you were like, I don't know if I'm going to do this. I don't even know if it's going to be a book or a project. Do you remember? That was a long time ago. And to see it in its version, I thought I would bring my copy along so you can kind of, I've scooped it up from my, dining table, and it's been pushed back in whichever order I found them in. And I think that you'd said maybe we could talk a bit about the format. I mean, there's so much to ask you. I suppose, first of all, I wanted to kind of go back a bit to the beginning of your relationship with Nevelson. When did you first encounter her? Were you taught her as an art history student? Did you, I mean, where did she appear?
No, the answer is no. I was not taught her. Like I said, she has kind of an odd beast, in kind of chronologies of 20th century American art. She appears for the first time in Janssen's History of Art in 1986, which actually is the first volume that included any woman at all, just to remind us all of how deeply biased this discipline has been for so long. And she is there under the heading of assemblage. So that is where she is acknowledged as kind of like that's where her place is. But assemblage is also a strange fit, So no, I didn't encounter her as a student. It's very hard to reconstruct. I mean, she had a public sculpture in Houston, which is my hometown. Not that I ever paid any attention to it. In fact, I was surprised to learn it existed. Public sculpture is always quite, gets very assimilated into its environment. So I can't exactly recollect, to be quite honest. I mean, it's possible I encountered her as a child because she did appear in Highlights for Children magazine, which was passed out at my school. That's possible. I can't but I will say that how I came to it as a research topic was actually due to our dear Jo here, who issued me an invitation. I had just finished the proofs of Frey, or like Frey was kind of off my table, and I was like, I can't, enough of textiles. But I got an invitation to be a keynote along with the lovely, brilliant Mignon Nixon, who's also in the room, for a conference about domesticity and feminism. And I had just nothing in my mind. I had just big pushed, finished this other book, and I weirdly, I mean, maybe sometimes things are so meandering, but I went to LACMA to see the Noah Purifoy show, who's another assemblage artist, Black American, had a big show at LACMA. And I was kind of standing in front of one of his pieces that was also all wood, kind of a furniture-esque thing, and immediately thought of Louise Nevelson and thought that I don't know, it was kind of an aha moment, kind of standing in one person show, interestingly, but it's through Purifoy, to be honest. I kind of came to appreciate Nevelson more standing in front of Nevelson. And in fact, during the research process, so I published that article that I gave as a keynote, and it was kind of the kernel for this book, and I put them in conversation. That's part of the point of the article. And then in doing more research for the book, I found that Noah Purifoy had in fact made a piece called for Louise Nevelson. So what had been a speculative encounter suddenly became very real. And I have that piece reproduced in the book. And so that was a tender moment. That was exciting.
And the fact that the writing on her it's just impoverished. There's the biographies, there's catalogues, but it is quite surprising. And I think reading you on her and realising this, it seemed like kind of a strange blind spot given the amount of work there has been on assemblage by many of us, and somehow she's evaded that. And so I was thinking about this question of the monograph. You call your book many things like a counter-monograph, anti-monograph, and you really sort of turn upside down the idea of a monograph, if by that we expect it to chart the life in some kind of order. And so we have the physical manifestation of that, which is the modular monograph. But of course, that's a question dear to feminist art history, right? The question of what it is to write a monograph. I wondered if you could just say a bit about that, because we haven't, that word is everywhere, but it hasn't actually come up yet. So.
Well, you're totally right that that I struggled with this. I mean, I just struggled so much with trying to figure out how to kind of tell the story that I wanted to tell while also disrupting this convention, And of course, I love a monograph, I love a good monograph. I love sinking into that. I love the feeling that it provides that I'm gonna get a really comprehensive view of some facet of an artist's, It's nothing against a monograph, but it did feel to me like I did want to do something different. And like you said, for a while I thought this was a different moment. I was like, maybe it's going to be like 20 different pamphlets and each one dedicated to a question, because I don't have answers. Her work is really unresolved to me. And maybe it's just a bunch of questions, and it was going to be called 20 Questions About Louise Nevelson, and then that kind of felt that felt thin. And I do feel like, she deserves this meaty, extended, like deep dive. And I mean, I have so many fears about what ended up happening, even though this is what I wanted and what I pushed for, but now I worry, this is not the book, like this one volume, and I worry that people will only read that, and this is only a fourth of what I'm trying to do. But that's true of every book. We fool ourselves thinking that people are going from page 1 to page 300 in order.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that the idea of thinking about how someone's going to physically encounter your book is crucial. I think we all understand, we all want these big hardbacks that nobody wants to carry, nobody wants to sit, and they're very kind of cumbersome. This idea of being able to take volumes, and it really does work that you can do. It really does work that you can read them in any order, because in a way that's kind of partly the text fight, really. But I thought, another question, is it a question? It's a comment I have, is these different modernisms that you introduce, and the amazing page spread you showed there with Ukrainian white work. And I think that this, the idea that they're using the constraints of what the publisher is giving you to kind of make to set the agenda for what this book's going to do is I think that's really important. And these different modernisms that you bring in, right, that this is not the usual cast of characters. So you bring in these other forms of work, these by indigenous artists, by works that might not necessarily fall under the frame of art at all. But I think you also give us an insistently contemporary Nevelson. And you say, you didn't want, your voice is there, and it isn't too much, but it is there. And I thought that you could, I just found that a very kind of exciting process, that you make contemporary comparisons to why this matters now, without that kind of eye to posterity. This is a book that feels it was written now and could only have been written now, and perhaps that's what you're gesturing towards there when you raise the question of wood. And the burning. I didn't know if you had more to say about that, and this is really leading to questions about the process of writing this and the kind of writing. So we've talked about the physical, the choices you made physically, but there's also choices in what kind of writing you've done here.
Thank you. I know, yes, these are all huge issues that I thought about constantly and really vexed me. And part of what, I think I was pretty keen to make the case, to make the case that she matters to us now. And I don't, I've had criticisms, like it's very presentist or it's anachronistic, because I'm putting her in conversation with, Jenny C. Jones or people, very contemporary artists who, by the way, fully acknowledged, that she is a touchstone for them. I would say to those people, like, okay, yes, that's right, because works don't just exist in the moment in which they are made. Obviously, they travel through time. We encounter them now. It's in our fleshy being and our present time, So they've traveled with us. We are co-present with them. I don't have to only think about what did people say in 1959. To me, that's one kind of art history, and it's perfectly valid. I was telling a bunch of different other kinds of stories about how the work continues to last, continues to speak to people, continues to, we continue to be contemporaneous with it, because that's the nature of a piece of art, a sculpture in a gallery. So I felt like, it is a very, of course I also do put her in her moment, I'm trying to do.
Well, this is where the question of drag, you said you would come back to some other, the other meanings of drag that you employ, and perhaps that is one of those, right, the temporal.
The temporal drag, right, that she was belated. I heard that, read that so many times and heard that so many times. It was amazing the responses that I would get from art historians when I said I was working on her, during those 10 years. Like, some people, especially women, were like, great, thank you, we need that book, Or artists, so many artists, like, I love Louise Nevelson, But art historians were, somewhat suspicious, or I even had one very famous male art historian say, Louise Nevelson, yuck. That was his response, was yuck. And I just thought, this, the sexism is still really with us. In part, she did fall out. She didn't just fall out, she was plainly excluded from Greenbergian notions of high modernism, because she made reliefs. She was neither a painter nor a sculptor in that sense. The relief is precisely that, which Greenbergian modernism can't really kind of grapple with, which she knew, and she was really angry about that, actually. She had a lot of anger. She had a lot of productive anger. So yes, so to get back to the question of like, that was a sort of question about modernisms, but also in terms of the way I was writing it was to also pay attention to the fact that the work is still alive, you know, and artists like are still returning to it. And why that's just as important a story to tell as what, you know, a critic said in 1962.
Absolutely. And we're seeing more of her works, I think, like the huge, you know, we're starting to see, because they take up a lot of kind of real estate, so museums have to make some decisions. The same thing happened with people like Montague and so on over the years, like how much space are we willing to give these large pieces, and you are seeing them more now. What was the reception of your show in Venice when this was this big show there? How did that go down?
Oh, it was
in the centre of the contemporary art.
Yeah, I know, yeah. Well, that was such a, it was, I mean, to see her work there, she was one of 3 artists who represented, was in the pavilion, the American Pavilion in 1962. So it was the 60th anniversary of her inclusion, and so it was very meaningful. It was like a very meaningful, you know, anniversary. And I mean, I think people were totally surprised. They thought they knew what Nevelson looked like. You know, they had that story of like, oh, it was just this all looked the same, black, wood, monochrome, blah. But there were all these surprising collages. They're fascinating. And then there was a lot of large-scale, bigger work that kind of breaks the frame, or there's an entire bed frame, and there's twisted car parts, like things that people didn't, you know, aggressive, muscular work that really takes up space. And I think, like you said, it does take up, there is real estate, you know. She was always, like, she never wanted to work small, you know? She was always convinced that she was like one of the big boys and she belonged in history, and that part of her anger was that she was not getting her due. And so I felt that people were really just kind of like, they were blown away by her assuredness, you know? And I think the show demonstrated that.
Because however much they engage with the domestic, Phila de Bala used to say, you know, she liked that her work takes up space. She was very kind of like elbows out.
Exactly.
And she liked it.
Totally.
She was just going to fill whatever space. She was going to kind of overwhelm the space. And I think that with these kind of domestic themed works that absolutely do the same in some ways. Thank you. Let's see if we've got any comments or questions or remarks from that. Oh, do we have, so if you can just hang on for the microphone, it's going to come round. Thank you. So we've got one here. Yeah.
I think it's not on, is it?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about your queer reading of Louise Nevelson's work and beyond the speculations about social history data. And that said, I would actually like to underline that politics of gossip are of enormous importance for queer history.
Absolutely.
So I think we'll never downplay that. But I'm more interested at this point in your reading, a close reading of the work itself, in terms of the strategies and gestures and attitudes that one could integrate in a deeper way and a very interesting way.
Thank you.
From a queer perspective.
Yeah, well, as you say, I take the gossip very seriously. That is how queer histories have been written, you know? If we didn't have innuendo or gossip, we would have nothing. We'd be completely erased from history. So that's a big part of it, is taking her non-standard domestic arrangement, you know, really grappling with that, but also just her very active conjoining very unlike things and putting them in relation. So I have a lot, I mean, there's a lot to be said there, but I think for me, part of it is about how do we understand very discrete functions, pulling them under the same, you know, pulling them together in the same conversation, or putting them on the same plane, you know, leveling them to the same kind of non-hierarchical field, to me is a kind of queering of sculptural form and the assemblage. So I have a lot, I mean, there's a lot to say about that, I guess. Yeah, but that's just one gesture. I also do think that she queers the monochrome because of the accrual of dust, and in part. I mean, they travesty the monochrome. In fact, they're not monochromes. They are gradients. They are not, you stand in front of one, they are not all black. There's not any way in which there is one field of color there. Like, not only because of the recessions, they're, you know, lit so that some are dark, some areas are darker and some are lighter, but they are just these machines for catching dust. And any one that you see it's just the impossibility of cleaning the dust that accrues to every single seam and corner and like belly of the curved, of the turned wood, etc., means that they are all these gradients of gray. And so just the frank admission of that bodily, these bodily secretions in a way, or these like bodily emissions, because, we are dust, dust is us, is another way that she's kind of like refusing the homogeneity of the monochrome.
Spiderwebs too.
And moths.
Yeah.
There is a moment where I
go.
I go inside Mrs. N's palace, which is an environment that she made that's been at the Met for a few years. And it's, she was also a kind of pioneer of the idea of the environmental installation. She was one of the first to really consider like, oh, it should have blue lights and we should paint the walls this color, like really think about a total environment. Anyway, so I got special permission to go inside Mrs. N's palace, which when it was unveiled in 1977, you were allowed to go inside, but not anymore. And there are moths in there. Moths are a lot, like in the Met, it's very scandalous, Like, it's extremely scandalous. But there they were. So the idea too, of like this livingness, this animacy that these like ostensibly inert objects are actually harboring all of this secret life.
There's a question here, and then this one here, and then Sarah.
First, I want to thank you for introducing me to Louise Nevelson, who I wasn't familiar to. I want to just, connected to what you were just saying, to pick up on the notion of the work being linked to her body. Mm-hmm. Is this supposed to be some representation of her body? I'm not sure what you meant by it.
Right, I guess what I meant there is that in much of there is a thin literature. There are some things, people have been talking about her work, but it's not the same amount of attention given to other women sculptors of her generation. And often, I'll just give it one example. She had her last big retrospective, which was in 2007 at the Jewish Museum. The whole thesis of the show was that her sculpture was her autobiography in sculptural form, and it tied every piece was everything about that show was about like this is about her mom and her dad, this is about her divorce, this insistent pressing together of her life and her art. Just even though she is an abstract artist, you would think there would be a little more gap there, but it's something that women artists are constantly faced with, which is Ad Reinhardt gets to make a work that's all black, that's about, philosophy and optics and, religion, a million other ideas. Are we who is ever talking about how Ad Reinhardt looks, how he dresses, his I don't know what Ad Reinhardt, I can't conjure an image of Ad Reinhardt. I don't intimately know his marriage, but we know those things for Louise Nevelson because the gendering of art history around women's artists is so much about biographizing every gesture. So to me, like I said, the life is really important. The life, I'm not someone who's not interested in the life, but let's make some room for other things, Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you for that.
Thank you. Sarah, the question here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. I've always been deeply intrigued by Louise. I look forward to reading your anti-monograph. I wanted to say two things. One thing is that in 2005 at the Courtauld, we had a very historic conference called Born in Russia. And the idea was, when the Hermitage had this plan for a 20th and 21st century collection and couldn't afford Jackson and Pollock's and didn't want to be told to buy Jackson and Pollock's, that they would actually give huge place to people like Jules Zalitsky or Louise Nevelson, who would be the heroines. The hero and heroine, the prominent people. It's amazing to think that if, the tragic war hadn't happened and they were too pussyfooted to go, to actually go for that, there could have been a wonderful way in which Louise Nevelson was one of the great, let's not say completely Russian artists, but somebody that Russia had re-embraced.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, I wondered to what extent asking not a direct biographical question, but it seems to me there's a lot to do with loss and even potentially mourning in her
Yes.
work. I wonder if you address it. But the second question is, I'm afraid to say, it's not again entirely biographical. I'm thinking of Germaine Richier, who also was not recognised. For her, 1959 is also an important year. If she, I'm afraid to say this because it's autobiographical, if she got divorced without alimony,
Yeah.
how did she
live?
sustain
Yeah.
herself? Because Germaine Richier, for example, taught, which was very interesting.
Yeah,
So-
they're both great questions, and thank you very much.
Just how did she live?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second one
Yeah.
first, which was, yes, so she refused alimony. She had not a penny, but her family, her brother supported her. Her brother, who had taken over just a little, I mean, the biography matters. I include the biography many times. It's not excluded whatsoever from the parameters of the book. And it's important because, like I said, materially, I needed to know, where is she getting her wood, you know? And it led precisely to her scavenging things from construction, sites. But so when the family moved to Rockland, Maine, her father was a peddler and then had a lumber yard, importantly, so she had a deep, intimate, familial relationship with wood and lumber especially. And then he later got into the construction business, and her brother took that over, and so he was making a pretty decent living, and he gave her, Nevelson, a small stipend after she got divorced. So she was kept aloft by her family for literally 2 decades, because she did not sell she worked without selling a single piece for 2 decades. And just, again, this incredible vision and persistence, that she knew she was going to make it, or she knew she, had to keep going. And finally, then, she became enormously famous. I mean, she was on the David Letterman show. There is a postage stamp of Louise Nevelson. Like, she was one of the most famous artists alive when she died in 1988. And then she kind of fell so fast into obscurity. It's kind of bizarre. So the first question, remind me again, was about Russia.
Well, I just said born in Russia, but
Born in
then
Russia.
it linked into the idea of mourning and loss.
Oh, mourning loss. It's such a great question. The piece that I showed, Homage to 6 Million, that piece is so redolent of mourning and loss and kind of shuttered niches, or like things left behind, and like an assemblage of things that like have, like fragments of a former life, and so much of the work to me is about an exploded sense of a safe home, that's been reassembled with some care. So I completely agree with that reading. Thank you.
We got time for maybe one last
Yes,
comment.
maybe
Up here. Yeah.
Right, so thank you very, very much for that. I discovered Louise Nevelson through when I was a student of Jo, and then I read you an amazing essay on keeping house with Louise Nevelson. Why do you think she was, what contributing factors were to her re-acknowledgement and her re-recognition? The reason I'm asking is because I'm writing and I'm trying to champion a very good friend of Nevelson, who was Dorothy Dana. Who didn't have the same personality, who didn't have, a brilliant galleries. What do you think contributes to that suddenly this visibility?
This visibility.
Like the Venice Biennale, is it you, is it galleries,
Right.
is it personality? Why her and not others?
I know. Great question. There's all these like kind of alchemical, ways that the art market and the art world moves that I think are very mysterious to me. Vapors in the room that are kind of collect around a certain figure. I will say that part of why she fell out of obscurity, or maybe, arguably, is that after she died, there was a really ugly palimony battle between Diana McCown and her son, who she had abandoned, Mike Nevelson, and she did not leave Mike Nevelson like a stick. She did not leave him anything. And she left Diana McCown some pieces. But Mike Nevelson sued Diana. It was a really ugly battle. It was even reported in Time magazine. And so for something like 15 years, very little of the work was available in the art market. Like it just kind of was locked in this legal battle. And that, I've been told, or I don't know how the art market works, I have no idea, to be honest. It's not, but I've been told that like that would have been a moment for her to kind of like, be absorbed in institutions, but none of the work was for sale because of this legal battle. I think also So that's partially why she fell out of favor. I mean, also the work has always been only spottily included in favor to begin with. I mean, she was famous because she was this, like I said, a huge personality, and she, her gnomic pronouncements, she's always like making her pronouncements with her cigarillo, and she did die of lung cancer. Every picture of her, she's got a cigarette in hand. The rediscovery, quote unquote, I don't even really want to call it that, but a return to attention is, I think, a number of factors. One is, the art world recognizing like, oh, women, hello, we need to like have, these obviously grotesque discrepancies. And a lot of people she was in a lot of institutions that just weren't showing her for a while, but it's like, oh, let's like dust off, or not really, right? Let's like re-spray paint the Nevelson and put it on view. So that's been happening kind of steadily for 10 years. Yeah, and I mean, I do think like the fact that, I wrote a book about her, or I wrote it helps. I mean, I won't disavow the fact that what we do has some relationship to how these gears churn perhaps, but I don't know. Yeah, it's such a good question, mysterious to me. I mean, if anybody else has ideas why. I do think it's just in part a recognition that like, oh, we already own these Nevelsons, let's bring them out because there's such an imbalance in our walls, right?
I think so. Thank you, Julie. Before we thank Julie, I just wanted to round up by saying this really is an extraordinary book, and I did read it in fact, I read it through in one shape early on, obviously, because it was sent to me in a certain format, and then reading it in its kind of random, and I've been doing this a lot, experimenting with it. It's extraordinary, not just because of the structure, but because of Julia's writing, and I think something that I find, there's so many things I find just extraordinary about you as a scholar and a writer, but your writing is so rich and complex and so accessible, and I would say that to everyone in the room, that this is a deeply scholarly academic book. This is a deeply readable, enjoyable, clear book. And that is true, and it's part of the politics of who you are as a writer and an art historian, that kind of accessibility. So I would urge you to look into this and her many other writings. I know that students will have met Julia's writing many times, from all of us here at the Courtauld. It's always an absolute treat having you here. So thank you very much. Thank you all for
being here. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you.